The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. Chapter 1. Tom Makes a Promise. Tom looked behind him and saw the man coming out of the green cage bar heading his way. Tom walked faster, but the man was definitely following him. He had first noticed him 5 minutes ago, watching him from a table as if he wasn't quite sure. But he had looked sure enough for Tom to pay for his drink and quickly leave. Tom ran across Fifth Avenue. Should he go into Raoul's bar and have another drink, or should he try to escape the man down Park Avenue? He decided on Raoul's. He went in and ordered himself a gin and tonic. Then he stood at the bar and watched the door. A few minutes later, the man entered. Was he a policeman or a detective? He didn't look like either. He looked like a businessman, somebody's father, well-fed and gray-haired. My God, what did he want? They couldn't give me more than 10 years in prison, could they? Tom thought. The man came toward him, and Tom suddenly had a moment of terrible regret. Excuse me, are you Tom Ripley? The man said. Yes. My name is Herbert Greenleaf, Richard Greenleaf's father. His face was friendly, smiling and hopeful. You're a friend of Richard's, aren't you? Tom started to remember. Dickie Greenleaf. A tall, blond man who Tom had known for a while. He had a lot of money. Oh, Dickie Greenleaf, yes, he said. And you know Charles and Marta Shriver, don't you? They're the ones that told me about you, that you might, Do you think we could sit down at a table? Yes, said Tom happily, and picked up his gin and tonic. He followed the man to an empty table. I'm safe, he thought. No one was going to arrest him. This was about something else. Maybe Richard needed help, or maybe his father just needed advice. Tom knew what to say to a man like Mr. Greenleaf. I've seen you once before, I think, said the man, sitting down. Didn't you come up to the house once with Richard? I think I did. I think the Shrivers gave me a description of you. He turned to order a beer from the waiter. We've all been trying to find you. Then someone told them that you sometimes go to the Green Cage Bar. The Shrivers seem to think you knew Richard quite well. I remember him, yes, but I don't think I've seen him for a couple of years. He's been in Europe for 2 years, said Mr. Greenleaf. The Shrivers speak very highly of you and thought you might have some influence on Richard. I want him to come home. We need him here, but he won't listen to me or his mother. You see, I know so few of Richard's friends now. Tom remembered going to a cocktail party at the Shrivers with Dickie Greenleaf. So that's how it had happened. He had only met the Shrivers 3 or 4 times in his life. The last time was to help with Charlie Shriver's tax bill and make it lower for him. Had Charlie told Mr. Greenleaf that he was intelligent, honest, and happy to help people? That was a mistake. Well, why won't Richard come home? Asked Tom. He says he prefers living over there, but his mother's quite ill right now. She has cancer and might not live another year. He says he's painting, but he's not talented enough to be a painter. He could create beautiful boats, though. You're the first of Richard's friends who have been happy to listen. They all think I'm trying to control his life. Tom could easily understand that. I wish I could help, he said politely. He remembered now that Dickie's money came from a shipbuilding company. Small sailing boats. His father must want him to come home and run the family business. Tom was on the edge of his chair about to stand up. But he could feel Mr. Greenleaf's disappointment. Where's Dickie staying in Europe? Tom asked, not caring where he was staying. In a village called Monghibello, south of Naples. Spends all of his time sailing and painting. He's bought a house there. Richard has an income from a trust fund. Nothing huge, but enough to live in Italy. Are you working now? I'm in the accounting department of a small company at the moment, Tom said. Mr. Greenleaf watched him hungrily. How old is Dickie now? Tom asked. He's 25. So am I, thought Tom. Dickie was probably having a wonderful time in Italy. A trust fund, a house, a boat. Why should he want to come home? Dickie was lucky. What was he, Tom, doing at 25? Living from week to week, no bank account, running away from the police now for the first time in his life. He was suddenly bored of the conversation with Mr. Greenleaf and wanted to be back at the bar by himself. I remember fishing with Dickie at a weekend party on Long Island, he said. He was talking about going to Europe then. I'm sorry, I'm not free, or I'd be very happy to go over there and try to influence him into coming home. If you or somebody like you could at least get a couple of months off from their job, said Mr. Greenleaf, I'd be happy to pay for the voyage by sea and the living costs in order to send them over to talk to him. Tom's heart suddenly jumped in his chest. Then he made himself look thoughtful. I might be able to, he replied carefully. Do you really think you might be able to arrange it during this fall? I think Richard would want to listen to you. It was already the middle of September. Tom started at the thick gold ring on Mr. Greenleaf's little finger and smiled. I think I might, he said. I'd be glad to see Richard again, especially if you think I could help. Mr. Greenleaf offered to take him home in a taxi, but Tom didn't want him to see where he lived, in a dirty little apartment between 3rd and 2nd Avenue. He was staying with a man called Bob Delancey, who he hardly knew, but who had offered him a room where he needed one. He hadn't invited any of his friends to Bob's place, and had not told anyone where he was living. He was too ashamed. He knew he would not be living there for long, but now Mr. Greenleaf had turned up. Something's always turned up. That's what Tom believed. But there was one good thing about staying at Bob's place. He could get his George McClappen post sent there without anyone finding what he was really doing. He walked into his small bedroom and looked at the letters that had arrived, addressed to George McClappen, that very morning. There was a check for $119 to be paid to the Collector of Internal Revenue from that lovely Miss Eden W. Superall, and paid without any complaining at all. This increased his total into checks to $1,863. He wished he could actually cash them. It was just a game, really. He played it using some forms that he had stolen from the Department of Internal Revenue where he worked for them for a short time. He wasn't stealing anything, but perhaps he should call just one more person before he sailed to Europe. He would tell them the same thing, that they owed extra tax to the revenue, and see if they believed him. He was just waiting for one of those idiots to pay him in cash. The next night, he went to dinner with the Greenleafs at their huge apartment on Park Avenue. Mr. Greenleaf welcomed him in a friendly voice that promised many drinks and a good dinner, and then he introduced Tom to his wife. Emily, this is Tom Ripley. I'm so happy to meet you, she said warmly. She was what he had expected, blonde, tall, and slim, and very polite and nice. I don't think we've met before. Are you from New York? No, I'm from Boston, Tom said. That was true. Mr. Greenleaf led him into the dining room. They ate 3 courses that were brought to him by the maid, on a beautifully lit table. The dinner was wonderful and the conversation was boring. They talked about Tom's job in accounting and his schooling. Did you go to school in Boston? Asked Mr. Greenleaf. No, sir, I went to Princeton for a while. He hoped Mr. Greenleaf would ask him anything about Princeton, but he didn't. Tom had been very friendly with a Princeton student and had gotten lots of information about the place from him. Tom told the Greenleaf some of the truth, though, that he had been brought up by his Aunt Dottie in Boston. She had taken him to Denver when he was 16, and he had only finished high school there. He hadn't gone to Princeton or any other university. After he told them about his aunt, he felt uncomfortable, like he was in a movie and suddenly someone would shout, "Cut!" When they had finished the final course, Mr. Greenleaf brought in some photos of Dickie in Europe. There was one of him in the cafe in what looked like Paris and another one of him on the beach. This is Richard in Mongebello, on his boat, Miss Greenleaf said, pointing to a picture of Dickie in a boat next to a girl with curly blonde hair who looked healthy, but not very sophisticated. And that's Marge Sherwood, Miss Greenleaf continued, the only other American who lives there. Then she looked down at the carpet. Mrs. Greenleaf, Tom said gently. I'm going to do everything I can to make Dickie come back. Chapter 2. Dickie and Marge. Tom hated water. He had never traveled anywhere on it before. His parents had drowned in Boston Harbor, and Tom had always thought that this had something to do with it. For as long as he could remember, he had been afraid of it. It gave him a sick, empty feeling to think that in less than a week he would have water below him, miles deep, and he would have to look at it most of the time. Tom had told Bob Delancey that he was leaving in a week, but Bob didn't really seem interested. He decided not to tell any of his other friends that he was leaving. He wrote to his aunt in Boston explaining that he was going abroad and it might be another months or even years before he came back. He asked her not to worry and not to send any more checks. He left her with no address, so she would not be able to find him. It made him feel better. The checks were an insult when you considered how much money she might have sent him with her income. She liked to tell him that looking after him had cost her much more than his father had left in insurance. Maybe it had, but did she have to keep telling him? He could also forget about the time she had sent him to get ice cream while she sat in her car with her friend. When he came back, she kept driving away. Come on, you slow thing," she shouted. Then she had turned and said to her friend, "He's a sissy through and through, just like his father." On the morning of his sailing, Tom found a big basket of fruit in his cabin and a card that read, "Bon voyage, Tom. All our good wishes go with you. Emily and Herbert Greenleaf." Tom had never received a bon voyage basket before. To him, they had always been something that cost huge prices and were laughed at. Now, he found himself with tears in his eyes. He put his face down in his hands suddenly and began to cry. His mood on the voyage was calm and kindly, but he did not spend much time with other people. He wanted his time for thinking. But when people sat at his table on the ship, he spoke to them pleasantly and smiled. He wanted to show himself as a serious young man with a serious job ahead of him. He had his own private income and was not long out of Princeton, perhaps. He was starting a new life. Goodbye to all second-rate people he had spent time with during the last 3 years in New York. This was a fresh start. Whatever happened with Dickie, he would try his best, and Mr. Greenleaf would know he had, and respect him for it. A week later, he was in France. He passed through Paris quickly. He would come back here at some later time, he thought, and cross the sleeper train that would take him all the way to Rome. When he woke up the next morning, he was in Italy. He arrived in Naples late that afternoon and found a big hotel by the water. He had a difficult time ordering a fish dinner in a restaurant nearby because the waiter couldn't understand English. The next morning, he took a bus through Sorrento through the village of Mongibello. When it arrived, Tom jumped from the bus and pulled his suitcase down from the roof. There were houses above him on the mountain and houses below, their roofs red against the blue sea. He asked at the post office for Dickie's address, and an old man there tried to tell him in Italian and show him with his hands where Dickie's house was. Tom then asked if he could leave his suitcase there, and the man seemed to understand. After asking a couple more people on the street, he finally came to a large house with 2 floors and a metal gate. Tom rang the bell outside the gate, and an Italian woman came out of the house. "Mr. Greenleaf?" said Tom, hopefully. The woman smiled and pointed down at the sea. Tom went into one of the little shops in the center of the village to buy some swimming shorts, but he could only find something black and yellow that was not much bigger than a G-string. He put it on, then walked down a narrow lane until he came to a beach where there was a couple of cafes and a restaurant with outside tables. Tom walked along the beach until he saw him, about 300 feet away from the sand. His skin was burned dark brown from the sun, but it was definitely Dickie. He was with Marge. "Dickie Greenleaf?" said Tom, who had taken off his shoes and was now walking across the sand toward them. Dickie looked up, but Tom could see that he did not recognize him. "Yes?" "I'm Tom Ripley. I met you in the States several years ago, remember? I think your father was going to write to you about me." "Oh, yes," Dickie said. "This is Marge Sherwood. Marge. Tom. What was it? Ripley." "Nice to meet you," said Tom. "Nice to meet you, too," replied Marge with a smile. "How long are you here for?" Dickie asked. "I don't know yet," Tom said. "I just got here. I'll have to look the place over." Dickie was watching him with some disapproval, Tom felt. His arms were folded, his brown feet planted in the hot sand as he said, "I have to say, I don't really remember you from New York, but I can't remember much about America these days." "Well, we're about to leave," said Marge, smiling. "Would you like to have lunch with us?" "Yes, thank you very much," replied Tom. They made their way back up the hill, and 15 minutes later Tom was sitting on Dickie's terrace with a gin and tonic in his hand. Marge was in the kitchen talking to the maid. Tom wondered if she had lived here. The house was certainly big enough. It had Italian furniture, and there were 2 Picassos on the wall. They looked real. Marge came out onto the terrace with her gin and tonic. "That's my house right over there," she pointed. "The square white one with the dark roof. I've been living there for about a year." She was wearing a red swimsuit with a shirt over it. She wasn't bad looking, and she had a nice body if you liked the solid type. Tom did not, himself. Dickie came out with a cocktail. "How's my mother?" he asked. "She seemed okay when I had dinner with your parents just before I left New York. I think your father was more worried a few weeks before. He's also worried because you won't come home." "Herbert's always worried about something," said Dickie. The maid brought out some food. Tom said nothing as Dickie and Marge discussed a restaurant in the village. He had nothing to offer the conversation, so he sat looking at Dickie's thick gold rings. One had a green stone, and the other had a small picture cut into it. "What hotel are you staying at?" Marge asked Tom, finally, and passed him a cup of coffee. Tom smiled. "I haven't found one yet. Which one do you suggest?" "The Miramare is the best. Gigoreau's the cheapest, but it's got insects in the bed that will bite you," finished Dickie. "You're in a good mood today, aren't you?" Marge said, throwing him a lifeless leaf at him. "Then I'll try the Miramare," Tom said, standing up. "I must be going." Neither of them encouraged him to stay. Dickie walked with him to the front gate, while Marge stayed sitting down. Tom wondered if they were sleeping together. Marge was in love in Dickie, Tom decided, but Dickie didn't care about her. "I'd like to see some of your paintings sometime," Tom said to Dickie. "Fine. Well, I suppose we'll see you again if you're around." "I enjoyed the lunch. Goodbye, Dickie." "Goodbye." The metal gate closed with a bang. Tom took a room at the Miramare. He threw his suitcase on the floor, lay on the bed, and thought about Dickie. Why should he want to come back to subways and taxis and a 9-to-5 job? It was not as fun as sitting on a beach all day and having long lunches and owning his own house with a nice maid to look after him. Tom suddenly felt jealous. The letter from Mr. Greenleaf had just probably put Dickie against him. He should have just sat next to him at a cafe and pretended it was a chance meeting. Tom was angry with himself for being so heavy-handed and without humor today. Nothing he took really seriously ever really succeeded. He had found out that years ago. "I'll let a few days go by," he decided. The first step was to make Dickie like him. He wanted that more than anything else in the world. Chapter 3. Tom makes a friend. Tom left it for 3 days. Then he went to the beach on the 4th morning close to noon. He found Dickie alone, reading an Italian newspaper in the same place he had seen him first, in front of some gray rocks. "Good morning," Tom called. "Where's Marge?" "Good morning. She's writing a book, so she's probably working a little bit late. She'll be down." Dickie pulled on the Italian cigarette in the corner of his mouth. "So what have you been doing? I thought you'd been gone." "Sick," said Tom, dropping his towel on the sand but not too near to Dickie's. "But I'm all right now." He went into the water, not too far, and dropped down until it reached his shoulders. Then he came slowly back to the beach. "Can I invite you for a drink at the hotel before you go up to your house?" Tom asked Dickie. "And Marge, too, if she comes down. I have some gifts for you from your parents." "Oh, yes, thanks very much." Dickie went back to his newspaper. Tom lay down on his towel. Soon, they heard the church bell announce on 1 o'clock. "Doesn't look as if Marge is coming down," Dickie said. "Shall we go?" Tom got up. They walked up to the Mirror Mare, saying very little to each other. When they reached Tom's room, he gave Dickie some shirts and expensive socks that Mrs. Greenleaf had asked Tom to bring for her. Now, Dickie had the presents, Tom thought. He was probably going to refuse the invitation for a drink. Tom followed him to the door. "Your father's very worried about you staying out here, you know. He asked me to talk to you about it, which of course I won't, but I still have to tell him something I promised to write him." "I'm happy you're here," Dickie replied. "I may go back for a few days this winter, but I can't work for him. How would I paint? I like painting, and it's my decision about how I spend my life. So, thanks for the message and the clothes. It was very nice of you." Dickie held out his hand. Tom couldn't take it. He was about to fail in Mr. Greenleaf's eyes. "I ought to tell you something else," Tom said with a smile. "Your father sent me over here to ask you to come home." It was his last chance to make Dickie like him. "What do you mean?" said Dickie, frowning. "You're saying he paid for you?" "I have $600 with me that he gave me for the trip," Tom replied, smiling. "He approached me in a bar in New York. He recognized me from one meeting at your house, and we both know the Shrivers, who said that I might be able to help him. I hardly know the Shrivers. I told him I wasn't a close friend of yours, but he felt sure I could help him if I came over. I did told him I would try." He suddenly remembered Dickie's smile, the way the lips turned up at the ends. It was coming now. "I'm sorry," said Tom. "I don't want you to think that I'm just using your father. I expect to find a job somewhere in Europe soon, and I'll pay him back the money." "Oh, don't worry about it. He'll be taking it from the business." They had a drink in the hotel bar, and then Dickie invited him to lunch at his house. Marge met them there, and they sat and drank gin and tonics like the first time, but now the atmosphere had completely changed. Dickie made Tom tell Marge what he was really doing in Italy, so he made the story real funny, and she laughed like it was the best thing she had heard in years. "So, what kind of work do you do?" said Dickie. "You said you might get a job in Europe?" "Oh, I could do lots of things. Cleaning cars, accounting. I'm very good with numbers. I can forge a signature, fly a helicopter, cook, and do a one-man show. Shall I show you?" He jumped to his feet. "In the show, I'm an English woman in the American subway. She wants some American experiences." He began to act. "The woman tried to buy a ticket. Then she did a silly walk to the train, but got lost." Dickie felt in the back of his chair laughing, but Marge looked blank. "She looks like she doesn't have that kind of humor," Tom thought. Tom drank some of his gin and tonic and felt pleased with himself. "I'll do another run for you sometime," he said. "Come on, Tom," said Dickie, standing up. "I'll show you some of my paintings." Dickie led the way into a large room that had an easel in the middle of the floor. "This is the one I'm working on Marge right now." He pointed to the picture of the easel. "Oh," said Tom. It wasn't good in his opinion, probably in someone else's opinion. Her wide smile wasn't right, and her skin was too red. Dickie showed him other pictures of the village and mountain seas and beaches. They were all boringly similar, with the same reds for the houses and blues for the seas. Mr. Greenleaf had been right about his son's painting. Yet it gave Dickie something to do, Tom supposed. He felt disappointed about this because he wanted Dickie to be so much more. Dickie showed him around the rest of the house, and Tom couldn't see any signs of Marge in the bedroom. He was surprised to see so many books there, though, because he hadn't thought of Dickie as clever, but perhaps he was wrong. But he didn't think he was wrong in feeling that Dickie was bored at the moment and needed someone to show him how to have fun. They drank a lot of wine with the lunch, but Marge being there stopped Tom from talking about things that he would like to have talked about. After lunch, she went into the kitchen to make them coffee. "How long are you going to be here?" Dickie asked. "Oh, at least a week, I'd say," Tom replied. "Because?" Dickie's face was a little red from the wine. It had put him in a good mood. "If you're going to stay here a little longer, why don't you stay with me? Unless you'd prefer to stay in a hotel, of course." "I'd like that. Thank you very much," Tom said. The next morning, he moved in. Chapter 4. The Kiss. Later that day, Tom and Dickie went to Naples by bus, and then they traveled on to Rome in the evening. They met several friends of Dickie's in Naples, including a loud, red-haired American man called Freddie Miles, who Tom did not like. In Rome, they went to a music hall show, then got very drunk together, walking down streets, laughing with their arms round each other's shoulders. They slept in a park where they were woken by the police in the early hours of the morning. Following that, they traveled home and slept until 4, when they were woken by Marge. She was obviously angry because Dickie had not sent her a telegram to let her know that he was spending the night in Rome. "Not that I mind, but I thought you were in Naples, and anything could happen in Naples," she told them. She was looking at them both strangely. Tom kept his mouth shut. He had decided to let what they had done together be a mystery. She had decided to let what they had done together be a mystery. She had a look of disappointment that a mother or an older sister might wear. Or was she jealous, perhaps? She seemed to know that the two of them had become better friends in the last 24 hours than Dickie could ever be with her, just because Tom was another man. That was whether Dickie loved her or not, and Tom was sure that he didn't. But after a few minutes, the anger left her face. Dickie went out of the room, and Tom asked her about the book she was writing. It was about Mongibello, she said, and she was going to put her own photographs in it. Tom hated her high voice and the way she said things, but he tried to be nice to her because he could afford to be. He walked with her to the gate, and they said a friendly goodbye, but neither mentioned seeing each other later tomorrow. She was definitely a bit angry with Dickie. For 3 or 4 days, Tom and Dickie saw very little of Marge except down at the beach, and she was certainly cooler toward both of them. Tom could see that Dickie was a bit worried, but not enough to talk to her about it because he had not seen her alone since Tom moved in. Tom had been with Dickie every moment. Dickie seemed to love Tom's humor. He had lots of funny stories about people he knew in New York. Some of them are true, some of them aren't. They were sailing in Dickie's boat every day, and they never talked about when Tom was leaving. Tom wrote a letter to Mr. Greenleaf. "I think that Richard is thinking about whether to spend another winter here. I shall do everything I can to stop him from being here for another Christmas. In time, I may be able to get him to move back to the States." Tom smiled as he wrote it, because it was all lies. He and Dickie were already talking about going to Paris. Then, they planned to go sailing across the Greek islands this winter and then skiing in Cortina, although Tom had never skied. They even talked about spending January and February in Majorca, and Marge would not be going with them, Tom was sure. November came, and Tom was working hard to learn Italian, which pleased Dickie, who had even found a 23-year-old Italian boy called Fausto to give Tom lessons. They continued to see little of Marge, though one lunchtime Tom said to Dickie that he was worried they were not including her enough. He even suggested leaving Mongibello so that he didn't have to come between them. Dickie replied that it was stupid, but that afternoon he went on his own to try to make it up to Marge, which disappointed Tom. A little later, Tom was walking up to the steps to Marge's house. He was planning to apologize to her when he saw them on the terrace together. Dickie's arm was round her, and he was giving her small kisses on her cheek and smiling at her. Tom ran back down the steps, wanting to scream. He arrived back at the house, breathing hard, and went into Dickie's painting studio, his mind shocked and blank. That kiss. It had not looked like a first kiss. He went up to Dickie's bedroom and walked around for a few moments. He wondered when Dickie was coming back. Or was he going to stay and make an afternoon of it to take Marge to bed with him? Tom pulled open the door of Dickie's wardrobe and looked in. There was a new-looking gray suit that he had never seen Dickie wearing. He took it out, taking off his shorts, put on the trousers. Then he put on a pair of Dickie's shoes and a clean blue and white shirt. They had all fitted him so well. "Marge, you must understand that I don't love you," Tom said into the mirror in Dickie's voice. "Marge, stop it." His hands held the air as if they were holding Marge's throat. He shook her until she sank lower and lower. "You know why I had to do that. You were getting between Tom and me." Then he moved to the window and looked toward Marge's house. Dickie was not on the steps or any part of the road that he could see. Maybe they were having sex. He imagined it, difficult and uncomfortable for Dickie, and Marge loving it. He took one of Dickie's hats and put it on his head. It surprised him how much he looked like Dickie in the mirror. His nose, the lower part of his face. It was only his darker hair that was different from Dickie's. "What are you doing?" Tom turned round. Dickie was at the door. "Oh, I was just having fun," Tom replied in the deep voice he always used when he was ashamed. "Sorry, Dickie." Dickie slammed the door behind him. "Get out of my clothes," he said. Tom started undressing, his fingers moving slowly and heavily because of his shock. Until now, Dickie had always said, "Wear this and wear that" about his clothes. He knew that Dickie would never say it again. "Did you make it up with Marge?" Tom asked. "Marge and I are fine," Dickie replied in a way that shut Tom out of the two of them. "And another thing I want to say," he said, looking at Tom. "I'm not gay. I don't know if you think I am or not." "Gay?" Tom smiled, but only a little. "I never thought you were gay." "Well, Marge thinks you are." Tom felt the blood go from his face. He kicked off a shoe. "Why?" he said. "Why would she? What have I ever done?" No one had ever said it directly to him before, not in this way. "It's just the way that you behave," Dickie said in a disapproving way, then slowly opened the door. He walked out the room without saying anything more. Tom put his shorts back on and hurried downstairs to find Dickie making himself a drink. "Dickie, it's important for you to know that I'm not gay, and I don't want anyone thinking I am." "All right," Dickie said in a low, cross voice. Tom's mind went back to certain groups of people he had known in New York. Known, and then finally dropped. He regretted now having ever known them. When a couple of the men had tried to kiss him, he had rejected them. However, later he had bought them drinks or taken them to their homes in taxis because he didn't want them to dislike him. He remembered, too, his aunt calling him a sissy, and how ashamed he felt when one friend had said, "Oh, for God's sakes, Tommy, shut up." And just because he had said it in front of a group of people. "I can't decide if I like men or women, so I'm thinking of giving them both up." Actually, he was one of the most clean-minded people he knew. That was what was so crazy about this situation with Dickie. "I feel as if Tom began, but Dickie wasn't even listening. He turned away and carried his drink to the corner of the terrace. "Are you in love with Marge, Dickie?" "No," Dickie replied, "but I feel sorry for her. I care about her, and she's been very nice to me. We've had good times together. You don't seem to understand that." "Oh, I do understand. I thought you only cared for her as a friend, but that she was in love with you." "She is. You try not to hurt people who are in love with you, you know. I haven't been in bed to her, but I don't plan to. I want to keep her as a friend. Of course." Tom decided to give Dickie some space and went into the village for a coffee. He was glad that Dickie wasn't angry with him anymore, that he wasn't planning to tell him to leave. Tom knew Dickie's moods. By 5 o'clock, after he had finished painting, everything would have been forgotten. Tom was sure. Dickie would be back to normal. Chapter 5. A Change of Plan. Tom walked quickly into the studio where Dickie was painting. "Want to go to Paris in a coffin?" he asked. "What?" said Dickie, looking up from his picture. "I've been talking to an Italian man in Giorgio's. We'd get 100,000 lire each. I think it's a way of getting drugs there. He said there would be 3 coffins and there would be a real dead person in the 3rd coffin. They would put drugs inside that person. We would get the trip, the money, and the experience. What do you think?" There was a strange smile on Dickie's face, as if he thought Tom was joking. "I'm serious," said Tom. Then Dickie's look changed. "Are you sure this man hadn't taken drugs himself? He probably just got a dirty crook. If you want to do it, then go ahead, but I don't." Tom suddenly felt anger rise in his blood. "In October, when we went to Rome, you would have thought this thing was fun," he said. "Oh, I don't think so," replied Dickie angrily. Tom suddenly wanted to leave Dickie. He didn't like the arrogant way he said crook, like Dickie was above the other man just because he was wealthy. But then, Tom's anger suddenly left him. He wanted to make it up, but didn't know what to say. Dickie stared back at him with eyes that were empty and cold, and Tom suddenly felt an awful pain in his chest. They weren't friends, they didn't know each other, and it was the same for every other person he had known and would ever know. He had failed. "I think I'm going to go see Marge for a while," Dickie said flatly and walked out. After Dickie had left, Tom went to the post office to get his post. There was a letter from Mr. Greenleaf. "My dear Tom, as you have been with Dickie for over a month and he shows no signs of coming home, I can see you haven't been successful. I want you to know that my wife and I send our thanks for trying so hard, but we feel it is time to stop now. I hope that you have tried enjoying your trip in Italy, despite everything. With thanks, H.R. Greenleaf." Tom walked slowly back up the hill. It was the end of the story. He knew it. Tom knew what Marge was going to say. "Why don't you just let him go?" When Dickie came home, Tom did not show him his father's letter. Instead, he said, "Do you think Marge would come up to Paris with us when we go?" Dickie looked surprised. "I think she would." "Well, ask her," Tom said cheerily. "But I don't know if I should go up to Paris," Dickie said slowly. "I'd like to get away for a few days, but Paris?" He lit a cigarette. "I'd just be happy to go up to San Remo. It's a lot closer." "But when will we go to Paris?" "I don't know. Anytime. You go there if you want." Tom listened to Dickie's tone. He felt sure that Mr. Greenleaf had told Dickie that he was tired of Tom and thought that he was just using his money to have a good time. Only the other day, Dickie had asked Tom if he was going home for Christmas, knowing that he didn't leave a home to go to. It had been a hint that he should leave. He knew it. "Well, I suppose we'll go to San Remo instead then," Tom said. But instead, he could have cried and his hands were shaking. "All right," said Dickie. Marge didn't want to come with them to San Remo. She wasn't having a good run on her book. "But please, can you try to find me that perfume, Dickie?" she said. "You know, the Stradivari one I couldn't find in Naples." They took only 1 suitcase of Dickie's with them, because they only planned to be away for 3 nights and 4 days. Dickie was a bit happier now, but the awful feeling that this would be their final trip together was still there. Tom had never felt like a boring guest before, but this was how Dickie made him feel now. He stared at Dickie's rings and listened to him chat on about how small San Remo was and how he'd spent a week there once with Freddie Miles. Then, as the train was coming into town, he suddenly said, "By the way, Tom, I hope you don't mind terribly, but I think I'd like to go to Cortina with Marge this winter. You know, alone. You can't ski anyway, can you?" Tom's body immediately went stiff, but he tried not to show it. "Of course," he said, then nervously looked at the map he was holding. But Dickie was already pulling their suitcase down. "We're not far from Nice, are we?" Tom asked. No. And Canes, I'd like to see Canes, at least it's in France. Well, let's go then. You brought your passport, didn't you? Tom had bought his passport, so they took a train and arrived there at 11 that night. Tom thought Canes was beautiful with its long line of expensive hotels looking over the water. Dickie chose a smaller hotel on a back street, the Grey d'Albanian. It was nice enough, but if Tom had chosen, he would have gone to one on the seafront. They had breakfast at a cafe the next morning, then walked down to the sea. It was cool, but not too cool for swimming. The beach was almost empty except for a group of men in yellow G-strings who were playing some kind of strange game. As he and Dickie came closer, Tom could see that they were acrobats. "Look!" cried Tom. They were building a human tower. He and Dickie watched as the men climbed on each other's shoulders. When the last one, a boy of about 17, reached the top and put his arms in the air, Tom clapped his hands together. "Well done!" he shouted, and the boy smiled and waved back at him. Then Tom turned and saw the strange look that Dickie was giving him. He clearly thought that the acrobats were gay. Maybe Canes was full of gay people, but so what? Tom realized his body was stiff with anger. Dickie stood with his arms folded. "Are you going to swim?" Tom asked. "I don't think so," Dickie said. "Why don't you stay here and watch the acrobats and their G-strings? I'm going back." Then he turned and started walking toward the hotel before Tom could answer. They left for San Remo that afternoon, and Dickie let Tom pay the hotel bill. Tom had also bought their train tickets, although Dickie had just cashed one of his trust fund checks and plenty of money with him. On the train, Dickie rested back his head and closed his eyes, saying nothing. Tom stared at his arrogant, handsome face and was filled with a mix of crazy emotions. He felt insulted and wanted to kill Dickie. It wasn't the first time he had thought of it. The idea had came to him 2 or 3 times before and had lasted just a second or two before leaving him ashamed. But now he thought about it for a full 2 minutes, because he was leaving Dickie anyway, and why should he be ashamed anymore? He hated Dickie. He had wanted to be his friend, but Dickie had rejected him. He was pushing Tom out into the cold. If he killed Dickie on this trip, Tom thought, he could just say that an accident had happened. Then, suddenly, a brilliant idea came to Tom. He could become Dickie Greenleaf himself. They looked so much like each other. He even fitted Dickie's clothes. He would not be able to live in a place where Dickie had actually known people, of course, and his hair was a bit darker than Dickie's, but he could make it lighter. Then, he could use Dickie's passport and do everything that Dickie did. He could go and get Dickie's things from Montebello, tell Marge a stupid story, and then get an apartment in Rome or Paris. He could receive Dickie's check every month and forge his signature. The danger of it suddenly made Tom feel excited. And then, slowly, he began to think of how. Chapter 6. In San Remo. They arrived in San Remo, which was another small town with shops and hotels on the seafront. Tom thought about where and how he would kill Dickie. In the streets. At night, perhaps. They would be dark and silent by no one in the morning. If he could keep Dickie awake for that long. But how would he get rid of the body? It had to be completely disappeared. That left only the water. But Dickie was a strong swimmer while Tom was not. There were little blue and white motorboats. Tom noticed that people could rent at the beach from an Italian man, and each motorboat was a heavy anchor. "How about we rent a boat, Dickie?" Tom asked excitedly. Dickie looked at him strangely because Tom had not been excited about anything since they arrived here. Then he looked out to sea. It was 10:30 in the morning and the sky was gray. The kind of November gray that would not disappear all day. "Well, all right," Dickie replied. "Just for an hour." Then he immediately jumped into a boat, and the Italian man started it for them. As Tom got in after Dickie, he noticed a single oar lying in the bottom of the boat. Dickie turned the boat and headed away from town. "This is great," he said, his hair blowing in the wind. And Tom could see in his eyes that he was remembering other boat trips with Marge or Freddie Miles, perhaps. He sailed further and further away out into the empty sea. Tom smiled, but instead he was getting frightened. If something happened to the boat, there was no chance that he could get back to land. But neither was there a chance that anyone could see what they did here. He could hit Dickie, jump on him, or kiss him, and no one would see. Tom suddenly stood up and started taking off his clothes. "Shall I jump in?" he said. "I'll go in if you will." "Will I?" "Sure." Dickie slowed the motor so that the boat stopped moving forward and began taking off his shirt and his trousers. "Come on, then," he said, noticing that Tom still had his trousers on. At that moment, Tom picked up the oar and hit the top of Dickie's head with it. "Hey!" Dickie shouted, and his body sank heavily to one side. His eyes were wide with confusion and surprise. Tom brought down the oar again, harder this time. "For God's sake," Dickie said in a strange voice, before the oar hit him for a third time and he fell heavily into the bottom of the boat. Tom hit him again and again until Dickie's eyes closed and his body went still. The bottom of the boat was filled with Dickie's blood. Then Tom looked all around him. There was nothing on the water except for a small white motorboat some miles away, which was traveling fast toward the beach. Tom immediately pulled off Dickie's rings and put them in his pocket. There were cigarettes, a wallet, and a pencil in Dickie's jacket, and 3 keys on a chain in his trousers pocket. Tom took them all. Then he untied the anchor rope from the boat and instead tied it very tightly around Dickie's bare ankles. He thought the rope was about 35 or 40 feet long. The weight should be just enough to hold the body under the water, he thought. Tom threw the anchor over the side of the boat. The anchor went under the water with a kerplunk sound, and soon the ropes round Dickie's ankles went tight. Tom lifted them over the side of the boat and started pulling at Dickie's arms. He tried to push the body into the water, but it was heavier than he thought, and the boat started rolling wildly from side to side. Finally, Dickie fell into the water, but Tom lost his balance and fell backward against the motor, which made a sudden loud noise. The boat jumped forward, throwing Tom into the water too. The next moment his head came up above the water. He was shouting and fighting for air. He didn't want to drown after all this. He reached out for the side of the boat, but it was moving round him in crazy circles. 2, 3, 4 times. It came close to his hands as he caught one breath of air. He shouted for help. He got nothing but a mouthful of water. The boat came close again, and he tried with all his strength to reach it. This time his fingers just caught the side. He half pulled himself onto the side of the boat and reached for the motor. The boat slowed, then stopped. Tom stayed hanging on the boat's side, resting on, breathing hard. Slowly, he lifted one leg and the other and put himself back in. His whole body ached, and he had blood on his hands from the boat. He checked his pockets to make sure he still had Dickie's rings. Then he began to think about what he would do with the boat. He had planned to return it, but it was impossible now. Blood, he knew, was very hard to get rid of. He would have had to hide the boat instead. He turned the motor back on and headed slowly toward the land until a small beach came into view with rocks and trees around it. There were no people there. He took the boat toward the beach until he felt it brush the sand under it. Then he got out carefully and began to collect lots of stones, all about the size of a human head. He dropped them, one by one, into the boat. When he had enough stones, he walked with the boat out into the water as far as he could, then pulled one side down and again as hard as he could until water began to pour in. Slowly, the boat sank. Then Tom walked through the water back to the beach. When he reached it, he fell onto his stomach and rested face down on the sand. He returned to Montebello the next day after getting the sleeper train to Naples. The man at the hotel desk in San Remo had asked where his friend was, and he had replied that they were meeting at the train station. No one else had asked any questions. When he got off the bus, he immediately saw Marge. She was walking through the village on her way to the beach. "Where's Dickie?" she asked. "He's in a hotel in Rome," Tom smiled easily. "He's staying up there for a few days. I came back to get some of his things for him. How's everything here?" "Oh, boring," said Marge. She looked uncomfortable with him, but still she followed him up the hill and into Dickie's house. "You look like you've had a good time," she said a bit sadly. "How long do you think Dickie's going to be away?" "We did," Tom smiled. "I don't really know. He wants to see some art shows up there and just be somewhere else for a bit." Tom made himself a large gin and tonic. Then he reached for the suitcase. "Oh, and here's your Stradivari. We got it in San Remo." "Oh, thanks very much." Marge took the perfume and smiled. "I'm going up to Rome tomorrow to join him," Tom said. "Right, well, have a good time, and tell Dickie to write me a postcard. What hotel is he staying at?" "It's the one near the Piazza di Spagna." "The Inghilterra?" "That's it," Tom replied, "but I think he said to use the American Express for the address. I'd probably go down to the beach tomorrow morning before I leave." "All right. Well, thanks for the perfume." She walked down to the metal gate and left. Chapter 7. A New Start. Tom spent that evening collecting and packing Dickie's things. He took letters, keys, and some insurance documents. He took shirts, trousers, and sweaters, drawing books, and notebooks. Then he started looking around at the pictures and furniture. He would ask Signor Pochi, the manager of the Miramare, to manage the sale of the house and boat. Dickie had told him that Pucci did jobs like that for people in the village. He had wanted to take all of Dickie's things immediately, but was worried about what Marge would think about him taking so much for such a short time. He decided it would be better to tell her that Dickie had now written saying that he wanted to move to Rome. To help this plan, he went to the post office the following afternoon and collected a letter for Dickie. As soon as he got home, he started packing Dickie's best paintings. Soon after, Marge appeared. "Still here?" she asked, coming into Dickie's room. "Yes, I had a letter today from Dickie. He's decided he's going to move to Rome." Tom stood up and even smiled a little, as if it was a surprise to him too. "Move to Rome? For how long?" "The rest of the winter," he said. "He's not coming back all winter?" Marge's voice sounded lost. "No, you might even sell the house. He said he was going to write to you. He said, of course, he can't go skiing without you now, but you should still go. I have the feeling he wants to be alone." She was shocked and silent. Her face looked very upset, and she had tears in her eyes. After a minute, she said, "Are you going to stay with him in Rome?" "Maybe for a while, to help him move in somewhere. I want to go to Paris this month. Then I'll probably leave for America in the middle of December." Just wait until she got the letter he was going to send her from Rome, Tom thought. He would be gentle with her, but he would make her feel sure that Dickie did not want to see her ever again. Tom wore a cap in the hotel in Rome and gave them Dickie's passport at the desk instead of his own. The receptionist only looked at it quickly and didn't ask any questions. When he got to his room, he took out Dickie's old typewriter and wrote Marge a letter. "Dear Marge, I've decided to take an apartment in Rome for the winter. Just wanted to stay away from old Manji for a while. I need to just be myself. Sorry I didn't say goodbye, and actually I'm not that far away and hope to see you now and then. I just didn't feel like collecting my things, so I asked Tom to do it. Maybe it will help if we don't see each other for a while, but going away would help me to discover how I really feel about you. so I prefer not to see you for a while, darling. I hope you understand. I may go up to Paris with Tom for a few days, unless I start painting immediately. I met an older painter named Di Massimo, whose work I like very much. I'm going to paint with him in his studio. Write to me at the American Express, Rome, until I have found an apartment. I'm sorry about Christmas, darling, but I don't think I should see you that soon. You can hate me or not for that. All my love, Dickie. When Tom went out to post the letter, he went to a shop and bought some makeup that he thought he might need. He spent the evening practicing forging Dickie's signature for the bank checks. Dickie's monthly check was going to arrive from America in 10 days, and he had asked the bank to send it to the American Express in Rome. Then, he repeatedly imagined having conversations with Marge and Fausto and Freddie. Marge was the most likely to come to Rome, he thought. He spoke to her first as Dickie, as he imagined him speaking to her on the telephone, and then as Tom. He had to practice being Tom as well as Dickie, in case she found his hotel and came up to his room. If that happened, he would have to quickly take off the rings and change his clothes. But, mostly, he was Dickie, discussing things in serious tones with Freddie and Marge, then chatting and laughing with Fausto, and with strangers at a dinner party. He practiced speaking in both English and Italian. Every moment he spent in Rome was a pleasure, whether alone in his room or looking at art, or walking the narrow streets while he looked for an apartment. It was impossible to ever be sad or bored, he thought, while he was Dickie Greenleaf. They called him Signor Greenleaf at the American Express when he went there for his post. Marge's first letter said, Dickie, well, it was a bit of a surprise. I wonder why you made the decision so quickly. Tom was behaving very strangely, and I believe he's leaving for America when I see it. May I say that I don't like that guy? I think he's just using you and is a bad influence. Okay, he may not be gay, but he isn't normal enough to have any kind of sex life, if you know what I mean. He's just a nothing. You behaved like you'd realized this about him in the last few weeks, but now you're with him again and I don't know what to think about it. However, I'm not interested in Tom, but in you. She went on then to talk about Christmas and how much she would miss him. She ended by thanking him for the perfume and sending him love. She told him to write. He put Marge's letter back in the envelope, then he decided to write a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Greenleaf on Dickie's typewriter. Dear Mother and Dad, I'm in Rome looking for an apartment. Sorry I've been so bad about letters recently. I hope to do better with the quiet life I'm leading here. I felt like I needed a change from Montebello, so I may sell the house on the boat. I've met a wonderful painter here called Di Massimo, who will teach me in his studio. I'm going to work really hard for a few months and see what happens. Mother, I hope you haven't gone to great trouble for Christmas. I don't really need anything I could think of. How are you feeling? Can you get around much? How is Uncle Edward now? With love, Dickie. Uncle Edward was a brother of Mrs. Greenleaf, who was ill in an Illinois hospital. Tom had learned this from the most recent letter to Dickie from his mother. A few days later, Tom left for Paris by plane. No one questioned his passport because he had made his hair lighter. He made sure he frowned the same way as Dickie did in the photo. He took a room at the Hotel du Croix Voltaire, which some Americans that he met in Rome had told him about. Then, he went out for a walk in the cold December evening. He walked with his head up and a smile on his face. He loved the sophisticated atmosphere of the city, which he had heard so much about. He bought a French paper and ordered a fine d'Alou, because Dickie had once said that this was his usual drink in France. He smiled, Dickie's smile, at people. He was in Paris, and it was nearly Christmas. It was wonderful to sit in a cafe and to think of always being Dickie Greenleaf. By the next afternoon, he had been invited to a party by a French girl and an American man. He had started a conversation with them in a restaurant on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. There, he met lots of interesting, wealthy people and behaved like he had always wanted to behave at a party. This was the beginning of a new life. He got invited to more parties and met more wealthy people, but he didn't go into any case that he met someone who knew Dickie. Then he started traveling slowly back to Rome, stopping in Lyon and Arles and moving to Cannes. Nice. Monte Carlo. All the places he had heard of, and where he now felt that he belonged. Chapter 8. The Visitor. There were 2 letters from Marge when he got back to Rome on January 4th. She was leaving her rented house on March 1st, she said. She had not yet finished her book, but was sending it with photographs to an American publisher who was interested in it. She wrote, "When am I going to see you? I hate missing a summer in Europe after another awful winter, but I think I'll go home early in March. I was thinking about coming up through Rome, and we could travel around a bit together to all the places we like. Is it possible? What do you think?" The second letter was shorter. Tom knew why. He had not even sent her a postcard from Paris. She said, "Have changed my mind. I've booked a boat to leave for America on February 28th. I'm sorry I'm not seeing you, but I realize now that you still don't want to see me. However, if you decide you want to take a trip down to Monji before the 28th, you already know that you are welcome. Marge." At first, Tom decided not to write back to her, but the thing was that it made him uncomfortable, was that she might decide to try to find him in Rome. If she searched the hotels, she could find him, so he needed to find an apartment quickly. Then he changed his mind, and on January 10th, wrote to Marge to let her know that he was back in Rome and that he was painting again with Massimo. He said that he missed her but wanted to wait a little longer before seeing her again. The letter was written with Dickie's lazy, arrogant voice and really said nothing at all. He then found himself an apartment in the Via Imperial near the Finnegan Gate. He didn't plan to spend a lot of time in it. He just wanted a home somewhere after years of not having one. And Rome was a cool place to live. How wonderful just to be able to say, "Yes, I keep an apartment in Rome." As well as Marge's letter, he received one from Signor Pucci saying that he had sold 3 pieces of his furniture for 1,500,000 lire, and that he had a buyer for the boat. Tom was very happy about this, and bought himself an expensive meal in a restaurant that night. Tom spent most of the time quietly touring the city, buying nice things for his apartment and practicing being sophisticated Dickie Greenleaf. He was taking Italian lessons, and he thought that his Italian was now as good as Dickie's. He even knew the mistakes that Dickie had always made when speaking it, and Tom was sure that he made the same mistakes himself. Tom opened a new bank account for Tom Ripley, and from time to time put some money into it. Dickie had 2 banks, one in Naples and one in New York, with about 5,000 in each. Tom opened the Riley account with a couple of thousand and added the money from the Montebello furniture. He had to remember that there were 2 people to take care of now. Tom kept away from the Americans in Rome who might expect him to come to their parties. He was confident in everything he did and was sure that he would not make a mistake. From the moment he got out of bed, he was Dickie, brushing his teeth the way Dickie brushed his teeth, eating his morning eggs the way that Dickie ate them. He even had painted some pictures in the way that Dickie painted. Marge still wrote to him. They were funny, sweet letters which he hated. He didn't even like touching them, and after he read, he always threw them out in the rubbish. Finally, he wrote, "I'm giving up the idea of an apartment in Rome for the moment. Massimo is going to Sicily for several months, and I might go with him. I wish you good luck with Montebello." He had a ticket from Majorca by train to Naples, and then the boat from Naples to Palma on the night of January 31st. He had brought 2 suitcases from Gucci. They were the best he could find. He was in the middle of packing them one morning when the doorbell rang. Tom ignored it. It rang for a second time, and still, Tom ignored it. He continued packing, folding Dickie's shirts lovingly in the suitcases. He was doing this when there was a knock on the door. The doorman must have let them go up. Tom's hand was hot, and he felt ill as he went to answer it. He opened the door a few inches. "Hello? the American voice said out in the darkness in the hall. "Dickie? It's Freddie." Tom stepped back, holding the door open. "Dickie's just out to lunch. Othello's, I think. He should be back a little while." Freddie Miles came in, looking around. How had he found the place? Tom wondered. Tom quickly took his rings off and put them in a pocket without Freddie seeing him do it. "You're staying with Dickie?" Freddie asked, giving him a strange look. "No, I'm just here for a few hours," Tom said. Now, he had to get rid of Freddie without the doorman calling, "Buongiorno, Signor Greenleaf." "I met you in Naples, didn't I? Aren't you Tom? Marge told me Dickie had moved to Rome, but she didn't have any address except the American Express. It was lucky I found this apartment. I met someone at the Greco bar last night who knew his address. A young Italian man." Tom wondered how this had happened, because he had not told anyone where he lived. Had this man followed him home one day or night? He imagined a young, hungry face following him in the dark. It made him feel ashamed. Freddie looked down. "You have the same shoes that Dickie and I have. They're very well made, aren't they?" They were Dickie's shoes. "Yes, they certainly are," Tom said. "Can I offer you a drink?" But Freddie had already walked to the bedroom then. He stopped, looking at the suitcases on the bed. "Is Dickie leaving for somewhere, or did he just get here?" Freddie asked, turning. "He's leaving. Didn't Marge tell you? He's going to Sicily for a while." But suddenly, Freddie's face had changed. He was staring at the silver bracelet Tom wore on his wrist. Freddie was looking at it as if he had seen it before. "You do live here, don't you?" he said in a strange voice. "With Dickie? I mean, you're wearing his bracelet." Tom couldn't think of anything else to say. He could feel the arrogance and anger building in Freddie, and was a little afraid of him. He was the kind of man who would hit someone in the way he thought he were gay. "Othello's, you say? I'll try to find him." "Nice to see you again," Freddie asked, unpleasantly. Then he turned and suddenly left the apartment. A few moments later, Tom went to the door and opened it a little. He could hear Freddie talking in Italian downstairs. "Only Signor Greenleaf," the doorman was now saying to him. "No, Signor, I don't think he was gone out today at all, but I could be wrong," he laughed. Tom immediately heard Freddie running back up the stairs. He stopped back into the apartment and closed the door. He knew that Freddie would not stop now until he had found Dickie. Tom picked up a heavy glass ashtray as Freddie knocked for a second time. Then he opened the door and Freddie came into the room. "Listen, would you mind telling—" The ashtray hit him between the eyes. For a moment, Freddie looked shocked and confused. Then his legs bent under him and he fell onto the floor. Tom kicked the door shut and hit Freddie with the ashtray again and again and again. Chapter 9. A Bad Dream. Tom listened at the door to see if he could hear the doorman's footsteps coming up the stairs. There was nothing. The man had not heard anything. It was only 12:40. It was hours before it would get dark. He searched Freddie's pockets and found a wallet and some keys. There were 2 car keys on a ring that said "Flat." Inside the wallet was information about the car. A Fiat 1400 black 1955. Tom looked out the window, and there it was, parked opposite the apartment. Tom sat and thought for a long time, and then suddenly he knew what he was going to do. He would make it look like the robbing of a drunk foreigner. He had lots of time, but he didn't stop until the room was ready. He lit and burned down 10 or so cigarettes, leaving them in the ashtrays. He put a half-full bottle of gin on the table and filled part of a large glass with it. Then he poured some of it down Freddie's throat and drank some himself. He knew he would have it cleaned all back up by the evening, because, in the story, he was going to tell the police Freddie left his house around 7. But the house needed to be untidy because he had to believe the story he was going to tell the police himself. And after he told it, he would still be able to leave for Naples and Palma at 10:30 tomorrow morning. He hadn't wanted to kill him at all. Freddie and his stupid ideas about Dickie being gay. Dickie was his good friend. Of course he was not gay. Where was the sex? Where was the problem? He looked at the body and said angrily, "Freddie Miles, you died because of your own dirty mind." Soon after 7 o'clock, he checked to make sure the doorman was not there and then put Freddie's arm over his shoulder and lifted him down the stairs. He was very heavy, but Tom had to get him outside and into the car. Tom was a bit drunk from a mixture of gin and wine because if other people saw him, they needed to think he was drunk. But the street was quite quiet. Tom opened the car door and pushed Freddie into it. Then he put on a pair of gloves, wiped the door clean, and got into the driver's seat. He started the car and drove away down the hill and through the city until he reached a large graveyard on Via Appia Antica. He stopped the car and with some difficulty pulled the heavy body out of it, leaving it behind a large tree. Then he got back into the car and turned it toward Rome again. A few minutes later, he pulled the car into the side of the road and took the money out of Freddie's wallet before dropping it into a rubbish bin on the way out. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the telephone rang. "Signor Greenleaf?" asked an Italian voice. "Si?" The voice told him that the body of Frederick Miles had been found in a graveyard on the Via Appia Antica and that Signor Miles had visited him the day before. Was that right? "Yes, that is right," said Tom. "What time exactly?" asked the policeman. "From noon until maybe 5 or 6 in the evening. I'm not so sure." "Would you be able to answer some questions?" "No, you don't need to come to the police station. Well, we'll come to you at 10:30. You must not leave the apartment before then." Tom angrily put the phone down. He would miss his train and his boat now. All he wanted was to leave his apartment and get out of Rome. 2 policemen came. A short, older man with a polite, kind smile. He looked neither intelligent nor stupid. And then a younger one. "How was Freddie killed?" Tom asked. "He was hit on the head and the neck with something heavy," the younger policeman replied, "and robbed. We think he was drunk. Was he drunk when he left your apartment yesterday?" "We were both a bit drunk. Wine and gin," Tom said. He spoke in Dickie's Italian, making the same mistakes that Dickie had always made. The policeman wrote it down, and also the time that Tom and Freddie had been there, from about 12 to 6. He told him that Freddie had not said where he was going where he left. They asked him more questions. How friendly was he with Freddie? Was Freddie alone? How drunk had he been? "Not so drunk that he couldn't drive," Tom told them. "And what did you do yesterday after Signor Miles left?" the older policeman said. "I stayed here," Tom said. "After Freddie left, I had a little sleep, and then I went for a walk at about 8 o'clock. He told them this because a man that he knew from the apartments had seen him come in at about 8:45. He also told them he wanted to go to Majorca the next day. "We need you to stay in the city for the next couple of days," the taller one told him. "I'm sorry if you had made travel plans. Good day, Signor Greenleaf." Tom knew that the name Dickie Greenleaf and the address of his apartment would appear in all the papers the next day, so he decided to go and stay in a hotel. He didn't want any more people calling him from the apartment. He booked a room at the Albergo in Higuerta, and then rang the police station to tell them where he would be staying. He was at the Higuerta within an hour. He went out in the evening to buy the newspapers, then went to a bar to sit and read them. They all reported on Freddie's death. "American murdered on the Via Appia Antica," or "Via Appia murder of Americano last night." Tom read every word. Every newspaper carried the name Richard Greenleaf and gave his address. They all said that Freddie had a few drinks. Then, on the last page of the last newspaper, he read. He read it quickly, with more fear in his heart than when he had carried Freddie's body down the stairs. The boat had been found, and it immediately brought back the morning to him. Dickie, sitting by the motor. Dickie, smiling at him. Dickie's body sinking through the water. The newspaper said that blood had been found on the boat. The boat owner could possibly tell the police that very day the boat had been lost and that it was 2 Americans who had taken it out and not returned it. The police could then check the hotels for that day, and the name Richard Greenleaf would stand out like a red flag. Tom's mind began working very fast. If they found Dickie's body, they would think it was Tom's. Then it would be Tom Ripley who was murdered that day. They would think that Dickie had killed him, and Freddie too. When he got back to the hotel, there was a message from Marge. She had called from Montebello at 3:35 and would call again. He told the receptionist that if she called again, he would accept the call. He just had to keep on going and saying the right things to everybody. After that, he could go to Greece or even India or Sri Lanka, someplace far away where no friend of Dickie's could find him. What a fool he was to think that he could stay in Rome. He went up to his room and wrote a letter from Dickie to his parents. Then Marge rang, and he spoke to her as Tom. He told her that Dickie had gone out to the police station but would soon be back. "How is Dickie?" she asked. "Why does he have to talk to the police?" "Oh, just because he had some drinks with Freddie that day. I've been up north. When I heard about Freddie, I came down to Rome to see Dickie. If it hadn't been for the police, I'd never have found him. Anyway, I'll tell him to ring you as soon as he'll be back, shall I?" He put down the phone and lay on his bed. As he fell asleep, he thought of Dickie on the beach in Montebello, his deep, happy laugh. He was standing over him, water running from his hair, saying, "Tom, wake up, I swam." Suddenly, Tom pushed himself up in the bed, looking for Dickie, who seemed to be in every dark corner of the room. Tom moved quickly to the window and opened it, angry with himself because, for a moment, he had lost control of his own mind. Chapter 10. In Sicily. The next morning, 2 police officers came to see him at the hotel. It was the same older officer as yesterday. His name was Roverini, with a different, younger one. "Buongiorno," Tom said. "Have you found anything new?" "No," replied Roverini, "but another matter has come up. You were a friend of the American Tom Ripley?" "Yes," Tom said, "but he went back to America a month ago." "I see," replied the policeman. "We think he might be dead. You were with him in San Remo in November, weren't you?" They had checked the hotels. "Yes." "When did you last see him in San Remo?" No, I saw him in Rome." Tom remembered that Marge knew he had gone back to Rome after Montebello, because he had said he was going to help Dickie. "I don't know exactly when it was. I think I had a postcard from him from Genoa. He said he was going back to America." "Why do you think he's dead?" Roverini looked at his papers and then back at Tom. "Did you take a boat trip with Tom Ripley in San Remo? A little boat?" "Well, yes, I think we did." "Why?" "Because a little boat has been found with blood with it. It was lost on November 25th. That was the day you were in San Remo with Tom Ripley. Did you bring the boat back?" "Of course." "Do you still have the postcard that Mr. Ripley sent you?" asked Roverini. "No, I don't." Tom ran his fingers worriedly through his hair in the way that Dickie sometimes did. "Why don't you try Paris or Genoa? He always stands in small hotels because he prefers them." "Do you know any friends of Tom Ripley?" Tom shook his head. "No, I don't even know him that well. I think he had a friend in Florence, but I don't remember their name." "Well, we shall ask," said the second policeman. Before you go," Tom said nervously, "I want to ask when I can leave the city. I was planning to go to Sicily. I would very much like to leave today if it's possible. I will be staying at the Hotel Palma in Palermo, so it will be easy for you to reach me." "Palermo?" Roverini repeated. "Yes, I think that will be possible." "Thank you," said Tom. "If you find out where Tom Ripley is, please, would you let me know?" No police came for him at the Hotel Palma in the next few days, and there were no messages. He relaxed and began to enjoy Palermo. He loved the large square and the beautiful old buildings. He enjoyed spending the evenings alone, looking at Dickie's things, his rings on his own fingers or his wallet and shirts. After Sicily would come Greece. he definitely wanted to see Greece. He wanted to see it as Dickie Greenleaf, with Dickie Greenleaf's money. But would things keep stopping him? He had not wanted to murder anyone. It had just been necessary. He really didn't want to go to Greece as Tom Ripley, an ordinary tourist. He wanted to cry when he thought about it. A letter came from him the next morning from Marge. He was glad when he read it. "Why didn't you call me back from the hotel? Or did Tom not tell you that I had wrong? It is obvious now that you are running away from me. Why can't you tell me that you can't live without your little friend? I'm just sorry that you weren't brave enough to tell me that you were gay. I think you should know that I've told the police that Tom Ripley is with you. They seem desperate to find him. Why? What has he done now? I've changed my boat and am leaving for America at the end of March. I expect we'll never see each other again. No hard feelings, Dickie. I just thought you were braver than that. Thank you for all the wonderful times we spent together. Best wishes for the future. Marge." Later that day, Tom wrote another letter to the Greenleaf family on Dickie's typewriter. He told them about Freddie Miles and said the police had finished their questioning. He told Dickie's mother about his health, which was good, and asked about hers, although he did not use the word cancer. 5 days passed. Calm, quiet, pleasant February days spent wandering about Palermo. But Tom was sad. He wanted a group of bright new friends, but now he realized that could not happen. Not unless he went to somewhere like Istanbul or Sri Lanka. And what use were the second-rate kind of people he would get to know there? But there was also Capri. There was still Italy. He had wanted to go there before, but Dickie had decided against the idea. On February 12th, the 6th day, a letter came from him from Dickie's bank in Naples. They asked him about the signature on the January receipt for his trust money when they suspected had been forged. Tom's blood turned cold. He decided to write to the bank to say that no money was missing, but how long would that keep them away? He had signed 3 receipts from Dickie's money beginning in December. Would they realize that all 3 signatures had been forged? 2 days later, he received another letter, this time from the police, asking him to return urgently to Rome to answer some important questions about Tom Ripley. Chapter 11. In Venice. Tom quickly destroyed the letter from the police and began to pack quickly. He needed to get rid of all Dickie's things. But how and where? Should he throw them off the boat on the way to Naples? Suddenly, he knew what he had to do after leaving Sicily. He would not go anywhere near Rome. He would buy an old car that had done lots of miles. He would say that he was traveling around Italy for the last 2 or 3 months. He had not known the police were looking for him. He went on packing. This was the end of Dickie Greenleaf, he knew. He hated being Thomas Ripley again. He hated being nobody. He hated putting on his old clothes and feeling that people looked down on him and were bored of him. So he kept the small things of Dickie's that no one would remember, except maybe Marge, like the new blue address book that only had a few addresses in. She had probably given it to him. He also kept the rings, putting them in a little brown box where he stored other interesting bits and pieces he had collected over the years. He sailed back to Naples the next day and immediately sent Dickie 2 suitcases and some of his own Dickie paintings to the American Express in Venice, using the name Robert Fanshawe for the sender. He then took a train through Rome, Florence, Bologna, and Verona, where he got out and went by the bus to the town of Trento, about 40 miles away. There, he bought an old cream-colored car. He also bought a newspaper, but could not find anything about the search for Thomas Ripley, Freddie Miles, or the boat that was found in San Remo. He slept in the car for a night. It was cold and awful, and he woke each time with a pain in his neck and back. But that made his story more real, he thought. Next, he drove to Venice and found it bigger than he had expected, and full of more Italians than tourists. He liked being able to walk across the whole city along the narrow streets and bridges without getting into one of those narrow gondolas. He chose a hotel called the Costanza, very near the Rialto Bridge. It was clean and cheap, the right hotel for Tom Ripley, although he had almost more money with him than he could carry. He had cashed $1,000 of Dickie's traveler's checks before he left Palermo. He bought more newspapers the next afternoon and went to read them in a restaurant in a tiny street near the Piazza San Marco. And there it was, on the second page. Police search for missing American. Dickie Greenleaf, friend of the murdered Freddie Miles, missing after Sicilian holiday. Tom read it carefully. Dickie Greenleaf had been asked to come to Rome for questioning over the disappearance of his close friend Tom Ripley after a holiday in Sicily. Ripley had been missing for about 3 months, the paper said. The paper also mentioned the checks, saying that both Richard's Italian and American banks believed them to be forged. This was despite a letter from Richard Greenleaf that said they were his own. Can anybody make a forgery against himself? Asked the paper. Or is the wealthy American helping one of his friends? Tom put the paper down and acted shocked. He even ignored the waiter who was trying to give him the menu until he touched his arm. He ate his lunch slowly and with pleasure smoked a couple of cigarettes. Then he got up and asked a policeman the way to the nearest police station. He wasn't afraid, but telling them he was Tom Ripley was one of the saddest things he had ever done in his life. The Venice police immediately called Rome and told them who had arrived and where he was staying. Then, they told him that someone who worked with Rome police would come that evening after 8 o'clock to find him. Tom spent the afternoon in his room making his hair darker. He put on his old glasses and wore his cheapest and oldest clothes. He wanted to look as different from Dickie as it was possible. At 8:30 that evening, he was visited by the policeman, Roverini, who had met him as Dickie in the apartment in Rome. His kind, smiling face did not look surprised at all, or suspicious. Another younger officer followed him into the room, and Tom realized nervously that this man had been with Roverini on the second of his visits. Roverini sat down in the armchair that Tom offered him. He made the room dark, with only one small lamp switched on. It was the way he wanted it. "You are a friend of Signor Greenleaf?" Roverini asked. "Yes." Tom sat down in another armchair in the darkest part of the room. "When did you last see him, and where?" said Roverini. "I saw him for a short time in Rome, just before he went to Sicily." "And when you were in Rome, did he tell you the police were looking for you?" Roverini was writing it all down. "No, I didn't know that I was missing," Tom smiled. "Mr. Greenleaf should have told you," the policeman said, smiling. "He has not been very helpful. And where have you been since the end of November?" "I've been traveling in the north, Milano, Torino, Pisa. I was sleeping in my car most of the time." Tom made lots of mistakes with his Italian, and his tone was rough and uneducated. He knew that he sounded very different from Dickie that they had met in Rome. "So this explains the mystery of the San Remo boat," said Roverini with a smile. "What's that?" replied Tom, frowning. "A boat was found in the water in San Remo. There was blood in it. You disappeared the same day that it went missing, so we thought that had something to do with you. But you're alive." "But didn't Signor Greenleaf tell you that I went to Mongebello after San Remo?" asked Tom, surprised. "I did some jobs for him." "He did not." The policeman touched his thick mustache. "And did you know Frederick Miles?" Tom shook his head. "No, I only met him once in Naples. I never saw him again, but... Well, I'm not sure, but I think he was also in love with Marge, Dickie's girlfriend." The policeman's eyes grew wide at that. "So you think maybe they argued about Miss Sherwood?" "I can't say. It's possible. I read that you think Dickie killed Freddie. Is it true?" No, the police cried. "But it is important that he shows himself in a police station. He was seen very drunk with Freddie Miles the night that he died. But maybe Freddie wasn't drunk, but already dead. And why is Signor Greenleaf hiding from us?" "I don't know," replied Tom. "As you say, he's not a very helpful guy. He didn't tell me in Rome that the police were looking for me, but at the same time, I can't believe that he killed Freddie Miles." After they had left, Tom could have flown like a bird out the window. He felt so light and free. Those stupid policemen. They could not see any of it, never guessing that Dickie was dead and could never have killed Freddie Miles. And now he, Tom Ripley, was safe. He decided to have an expensive 3-course dinner that night, somewhere he could stare at the beautiful Grand Canal. He had an idea while he was getting ready. He was going to find an envelope and write on it that it should not be opened for several months to come. Inside it should be a will, signed by Dickie, written on his old typewriter. The will would leave Tom all his money and his income. Now that was a good idea. Chapter 12. The Palazzo. Venice, February 28th. Dear Mr. Greenleaf, I hope you don't mind me writing to you about your son, but it seems that I was one of the last people who saw him. That was in Rome on February 2nd at the Inhelgerta Hotel. As you know, this was the only 2 or 3 days after the death of Freddie Miles. Dickie was upset and nervous. He said that he was going to Palermo as soon as the police finished questioning him. I felt he seemed very unhappy and that he might try to do something violent. He also said that he didn't want to see his friend Marge Sherwood again. What I'm trying to say is that I feel Richard may have killed himself because he has not been found. This is a very sad message to send to you, but I'm feeling more and more uncomfortable about this idea and thought I should let you know. Tom, Montebello, March 3rd. Dear Tom, thank you for your letter. I'm going Rome tomorrow to meet Dickie's father, who is flying over. I just wanted to say that I don't agree at all that Dickie may have killed himself. Dickie just wasn't like that. I believe he might have been murdered in Naples, or he's hiding somewhere because he just doesn't want to see people. But I'm glad you don't think the checks were forged. Dickie has changed so much since November. He could easily have changed his handwriting too. Nice to know your address finally. Thanks for your letter, your advice, and the invitations to Venice. Marge. P.S. I didn't tell you my good news. I have a publisher interested in my Montebello book. Now I just have to finish it. She had decided she wanted to be friends with him despite the things she had said in her letter to Dickie about him, Tom supposed. Dickie's disappearance was creating a lot of excitement in the Italian newspapers. There were photographs that Marge must have given them, of Dickie sitting on the beach alone in Montebello, and some of him with Marge. The newspaper called her the girlfriend of both Richard Greenleaf and Freddie Miles. Tom was happy to be described as a good friend of Mr. Greenleaf, who had helped the police a lot. Mr. Ripley, they went on to write, a wealthy American now lives in a palazzo next to the Piazza San Marco in Venice. Tom had not thought of his place as a palace before. He had rented a beautiful old 2-story house with an entrance on the Grand Canal that could only be approached by a gondola. There was a large key for this door and another, smaller one, for the normal back door, which led off to the street. Tom had filled the insides with beautiful old furniture and expensive pictures. He had employed a maid, Anna, and her husband, Ugo, to clean and cook for him. Because of the newspapers, Tom was well known in Venice now and had his choice of cocktails party. He had made wealthy new friends, including a nice Englishman called Peter Smith Kingsley, and a real countess, the very sophisticated countess, Titi. Everyone knew the name Tom Ripley, and that he had been friends with Dickie Greenleaf. They wanted to know him. Tom was always quiet and shy. He wanted to be seen as a gentle young man who was not used to being around lots of important people. The main emotion he showed them was worry about when he had asked about what had happened to Dickie. On April 4th, he got a telephone call from Marge. She was at the train station in Venice. I'll come pick you up, Tom said happily. Is Dickie's father with you? No, he's in Rome. I'm alone. You don't have to pick me up. I've only got one bag and I know where you live. It's next to Della Salute, isn't it? Well, okay. Have you had lunch? No. Good. He asked Anna to make lunch for 2 and told her she and Hugo could have the afternoon off. Then he made some cocktails. When he heard Marge on the door, he went and opened it. Marge, good to see you. Come in. He took the bag from her hand. "How are you, Tom?" she said. "Wow, this is all yours?" She looked around with wide eyes. "I rented it very cheaply," Tom said. "Come and have a drink. Tell me what's new. You've been talking to the police in Rome, and Mr. Greenleaf?" "Yes, and he's very upset, understandably," Marge said, sitting down on the sofa. "He's talking to all of Dickie's friends and to the police. He kept saying that they would do a much better job in America, but they found out that Dickie cashed over $1,000 of traveler's checks before he left Palermo. So he must have gone off somewhere with it, like Greece or Africa. He wouldn't have killed himself after doing that." "No," Tom agreed. He started asking her lots of questions, like what she had heard about the murder of Freddie Miles. She said that the doorman of Dickie's apartment had told them that Freddie looked angry, like they argued. Freddie had asked him if Dickie was living alone. Tom could tell that Marge was not suspicious about it at all. At that moment, Anna came in and announced lunch. Tom noticed her eyes go wide as she saw Marge. She recognized her from the newspapers. "So, what happened?" said Marge after Anna left. She was looking around at the apartment again. "Did your aunt die and leave you all her money?" "No, I just made a decision that I was going to enjoy what I have while it lasts," Tom replied happily. "I had $2,000 left, so I decided to spend it well and have a good time. The money should last until the summer. I feel like I deserve it anyway, because I spent most of the winter traveling around and sleeping in a car. I know that you thought I was with Dickie, but I saw about as much of him as you did." He made them 2 more cocktails. He could see that she was a bit more drunk now. During lunch, she asked him lots of questions about Dickie. Then she said, "And how do you feel about me? Tell me. Honestly, I can take it." "I think he was worried about you," Tom said carefully. "It was the usual thing. He was terrified of marriage." "But I never asked him to marry me," Marge cried. "I know, but—" Tom did not want to say it, but he made himself continue. "I just don't think he liked the responsibility of you caring so much about him. I don't think he wanted a serious relationship with you." That told her everything and nothing. Marge stared at him for a moment. Then she sat up and said, "Well, that's all water under the bridge now. I just want to know where Dickie has gone. Oh, I'm so terribly sorry, Tom." At that moment, she knocked over her cocktail, sending it down all over the table. Tom ran to the kitchen. "It's fine," he said, wiping the cocktail up. But he suddenly hated her. He remembered seeing her underclothes hanging over a chair on her terrace in Montebello. They would be hanging over his chairs tonight if he invited her to stay here. But he looked up and gave her a huge smile. "I hope that you'll want to stay here tonight. I have 2 rooms upstairs, and you're welcome to have one of them." She smiled back at him. "Thanks a lot. I will." Chapter 13. The Rings. The next day, Tom received a telegram from Mr. Greenleaf. "Have decided to come to Venice. Would like to see you. Arriving 11:45 a.m. Tom's body went cold. Well, he had expected it, but he had not really. He hated the thought of it. He and Marge went to meet Mr. Greenleaf at the train station. It was raining again and windy. Mr. Greenleaf came through the gate looking pale and tired. Marge kissed him on the cheek, and he smiled at her. "Hello, Tom," he said in a friendly voice, and shook his hand. "How are you?" "Very well, sir. And you?" They took Mr. Greenleaf to his hotel, and then found a restaurant to eat seafood lunch. "So, is there any good news?" Marge asked as they sat down. Mr. Greenleaf shook his head and looked nervously out the window. He told them that the police had not found out anything new, and he had arranged for an American private detective to fly over. He didn't think much of the Italian police. Tom listened, thoughtfully. He, too, had a suspicion that the American detectives were better than the Italian ones. "That's a good idea," he said, "although I think the Italian police are good." "Does your detective speak Italian?" "I really don't know," replied Mr. Greenleaf in a way that he said he knew he should have thought about it. "His name is McCarran. He's said to be very good. He's arriving tomorrow, or the next day. I'm going back in the morning to meet him." "Oh, Tom has the most beautiful house," Marge said suddenly. Tom turned towards her and tried to change his angry stare into a smile. The questions, he knew, would come at the house when he and Mr. Greenleaf were alone. But when they got back to the house, Marge sat with them for another half an hour in Tom's sitting room. She kept saying how sure she was that Dickie was still alive. Then, finally, she got up and told them she was going upstairs to sleep. After she left, Mr. Greenleaf stood up and began to walk up and down with his hands in his pockets. "Well, Tom," he said in a strange voice, "this is strange. This is a strange end, isn't it?" "End?" "Well, you're living in Europe now, and Richard, well, where do you think he might be?" "Well, sir, he could be hiding somewhere in Italy, staying in small hotels and using a false name. Though I'm sorry to say it, Mr. Greenleaf, but I think it's very likely that Richard is dead." Mr. Greenleaf's face did not change. "Because he was so unhappy in Rome? What did he say to you?" Tom frowned. I think the Freddie Miles murder had shaken him. He hated the newspapers being so interested, and said that if one more thing happened, that he didn't know what he would do. Also, for the first time I felt he wasn't interested in his paintings. Mr. Greenleaf looked up at the ceiling. "I wish that we could find this Di Massimo. He might know something, if he was real. The police can't find any painter named Di Massimo." "I never knew him," Tom said, "but Dickie talked about him a couple of times. I'm sure he was real." "You said, if one more thing happened to him. What else did happen to him?" "Well, I didn't realize it then," Tom said slowly, "but I think I know what Dickie meant now. The police had questioned him about the boat in San Remo. Did they tell you about that?" Tom had practiced what he told Mr. Greenleaf next, because it was better that he heard it from Tom than the police. "They found a boat in San Remo under the water. It had blood on it. The boat disappeared on the same day Dickie and I were there, and we'd gone out in the same kind of boat. They found the boat just after the Miles murder, and they couldn't find me at the same time because I was traveling around the country. So they asked Dickie where I was. I think that for a while they suspected Dickie of killing me." "Good God!" "I only know this because a policeman told me. I didn't know that I was being looked for until I read about it in a newspaper. Of course, now they know I'm still alive. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that Dickie knew the police were looking for me, but he never told me when I was in Rome. He didn't want to help them. He seemed to want to let the police find me. He wasn't going to tell them where I was." Mr. Greenleaf shook his head in a fatherly way that said he could believe it of Dickie. "I think that was the night he said that if one more thing happened to him," Tom finished. "I'm sorry, but I just don't believe that Richard killed himself," said Mr. Greenleaf. "Well, neither does Marge," replied Tom slowly. "I just think it's possible, that's all. Though I think it's more likely that he's hiding. He could have gone to Greece or France or anywhere after he got back to Naples, because no one was looking for him until days later." I know, Mr. Greenleaf said tiredly. That evening, Tom and Marge met Mr. Greenleaf for dinner. He was happier now because he had just telephoned his wife, and she was feeling better. It was a quiet dinner with just 2 courses, which Mr. Greenleaf paid for. Then he said he was going back to his hotel because he did not feel very well. Tom noticed that he was not eating much and wondered if he had found, like many other newly arrived tourists, that the Italian food did not agree with him. But you did not ask things like that to people like Mr. Greenleaf. Marge decided that she would travel back to Rome with Dickie's father the next morning. They all walked back to his hotel and said goodnight. Then Tom and Marge went for some drinks and coffee in a bar. It was very late when they took a gondola back to Tom's house. It was Marge who wanted it, of course. Tom had a bad taste in his mouth from the strong coffee, and his heart was beating hard. He hated gondolas. He felt tired and laid back in the boat while Marge talked happily. It seemed to take forever to reach the steps to his house, and as the gondola pulled away, he suddenly realized he did not have the big key to the front door. Before he could say something, Marge started laughing. "You didn't bring the key? Water on every side and no key?" Tom tried to smile. Why would he have brought a heavy key that was nearly a foot long? He turned and shouted to the gondolier to come back, but the man kept on going. Marge laughed again. "Oh, it doesn't matter. Another gondolier will come past soon. Isn't it beautiful here?" But it was not a beautiful night. It was cold and there were no gondolas anywhere. Finally, a small motorboat came by and took them to the nearest landing place. When they got inside, Marge went upstairs to pack her things and go to bed, and Tom sat down and read a letter he had received that afternoon from Bob Delancey. It was the first time he heard from Bob since he had got to Italy, except for one postcard. Bob said that the police had visited the house and were questioning everyone about a tax fraud. The defrauder had used the address of Bob's house to receive his checks and had called himself George McLappin. Bob seemed to think it was rather funny. The defrauder had not even tried to cash the checks, so it was not much of a fraud, Bob explained. Tom thought about New York and the strange life that people lived there. How boring it seemed compared to wonderful Italy. "I am jealous of you living there in Venice," Bob wrote. "Did you take lots of gondola rides? What are the girls there like? How long are you staying anyway?" Forever, Tom thought, closing his eyes. Maybe he would never go back to America. It was the evenings in Italy he loved the most, either spent here or in Rome alone, wearing his clothes or Dickie's, and staring at his things in the beautiful place that he lived. "Tom?" He opened his eyes. Marge was coming down the stairs barefoot. She had a small brown box in her hand. "I've just found Dickie's rings," she said. Chapter 14. More questions. Tom stood up. "Oh, he gave them to me to look after," he said quickly. "When?" "In Rome, I think, before he went to Palermo." He took a step back and pulled off one of his shoes and then picked it up with both hands. "What was he going to do?" Marge said with wide eyes. "Why did he give them to you?" He wondered why she had said it as he looked into the box, but did not ask her. He said, "If anything ever happened to them, he wanted me to have his rings." He was holding the shoe in both hands now. How he would do it went quickly through his head. He would hit her on the head with the heavy wooden bottom part of the shoe, then will pull her out and throw her body into the canal. He would tell everyone that she had fallen on the wet steps there and hit her head. She looked down at the box. Then Dickie was going to kill himself. He was silent for a moment, realizing her meaning. "Yes," he said. "I suppose if you look at it that way, the rings, they make it more likely." "Why didn't you say anything about it before?" "I think I forgot about them. I put them away so they wouldn't get lost, and I never thought of looking at them ever again." "You had better tell Mr. Greenleaf and the police." Tom looked at her. She was about to cry. This was the first moment that she had allowed herself to think that Dickie was probably dead, he realized. He dropped the shoe, put his foot back into it, and went to put his arms round her. He could smell her perfume. The Stradivari, probably. "Maybe he did kill himself then," he said. "Yes," she said into his shoulder. Then she turned suddenly, her eyes filled with tears, and went quickly back up the stairs. She was too upset to speak. He sat down on the sofa. He felt as tired as he had after he had killed Freddie Miles or after Dickie in San Remo. He had been so close to killing her. He remembered his cool thoughts of throwing her in the canal and thought of the words he would say to Mr. Greenleaf. He heard his own voice saying, "I stood there on the steps calling to her, but I wasn't sure if she'd hurt herself. I thought it was a joke." And inside he would be calm because his story was good, so good that he would come to believe it himself. But what frightened him was that he had already done it twice before. He could tell himself that he had not wanted to murder them, but he had murdered them. Of course, he felt regret. What was happening to him? What had happened? He had to face Mr. Greenleaf with the rings tomorrow, who would have to tell him the same story that he had told Marge. He started to think about it again, adding more information. He imagined Dickie taking off his rings and giving them to him and saying, "Listen, Tom, don't tell anyone about this." Marge rang Mr. Greenleaf at 8:30 the next morning. They arranged to meet him in his hotel room at 9:30 and traveled there by gondola. It was another cold and wet day. Mr. Greenleaf opened the door for them, and Toss saw a short, fat man of about 35 standing by the window. He must be the private detective. "This is Alvin McCarran," Mr. Greenleaf said. "He's come straight from the airport. This is Miss Sherwood and Tom Ripley." Tom felt Mr. McCarran looking at him. "So, you're a friend of Richard's?" he asked. "We both are," said Tom. They all sat down round a table at the far side of the room. Marge took the rings from her purse and gave them to McCarran. Then, Tom repeated the same story he had told Marge the night before. The detective listened carefully with a face that was hard to read. McCarran asked about the time and date he had given the rings to him, and if Dickie had been drunk. "No, he drinks very little," Tom replied. "He told me not to mention the rings to anyone, and of course I agreed. I put them in an old box that I have and forgot about them." The detective looked at him silently for a moment, and Tom waited, his body ready for a difficult question, or even an accusation. "And he is the kind of man to lend you the rings for a short time?" Mr. McCarran said. "No," Marge said before Tom could answer. "I can't imagine Dickie without his rings." "And what do you think, Mr. Ripley?" the detective said, staring at him. "I'm afraid I agreed with Miss Sherwood that it looks as if he killed himself," Tom replied. The detective then went on to ask him and Marge questions. When had they both last seen Dickie? What about the murder of Freddie Miles? He asked about the checks, but both Tom and Marge told him that they did not believe Dickie had forged them. Then McCarran stood up and said to Tom, "Would you mind coming downstairs with me if you have a few minutes?" Tom followed him downstairs and into the reception area. "Is this the way they do it?" he thought. "A quiet word and then an accusation? Then, after that, he'll go and give me over to the Italian police?" "Shall we go in here?" McCarran said, and led him into the coffee bar. "I wanted to talk to you about Richard alone," he said. What kind of man is he? Was McCarran going to approach his arrest like this? Or did he want an opinion to Dickie that Dickie's father and girlfriend could not give him? "He wanted to be a painter," Tom replied, "but he wasn't very good. He acted like he didn't care, but I think Italian life was making him unhappy. And things were difficult for Marge." "How do you mean?" "She was in love with him, and he wasn't in love with her. He was never going to marry her, but Marge wouldn't give it up. I think that's why Dickie left Montebello. He told me this in Rome when I saw him. He seemed nervous and said that, after the Miles murder, he didn't want to see Marge. He was worried she would come to Rome when she heard about it." McCarran drank some of his coffee. "Why do you think he was nervous about the Miles murder?" "Because they had been good friends," Tom explained, "and Freddie had just been killed just a few minutes after leaving his house." "Do you think Richard killed Freddie?" "No, I don't. He had no reason." "Do you think that Richard was the kind of man to kill someone?" Tom frowned for a moment, like someone trying hard to discover the truth. "I never thought about it," he said finally. "I don't know what kind of people are likely to kill someone, but I have seen him angry." "When?" Tom talked about the 2 days in Rome when Dickie had moved out of his apartment to avoid phone calls from friends and strangers. At the same time, he had grown more and more unhappy about his painting. He described Dickie as a proud young man who was angry with his father and did not want to work in the family business. His moods changed very quickly, Tom explained, being nice to strangers and then suddenly angry with friends for no reason. It would explain a lot if he had killed Freddie Miles, wouldn't it? "Yes," Tom said. "Everything." "Well, this is only my first day of work," McCarran said with a smile. "I haven't looked at the police report in Rome. I'll probably want to talk to you again after I've been there." Tom stared at him. It seemed to be over. "Are you going to Rome today?" he asked. "Yes, in a couple of hours, with Mr. Greenleaf." "Do you speak Italian?" "Not very well, but I can read it. My French is better," McCarran said, as if it were not important. It was very important, Tom thought. He could not imagine McCarran getting all the information he needed from Roverini. Neither would he be able to talk to the doorman at the apartment in Rome. McCarran finished his coffee and stood up. "Knowing Dickie, what places do you think he might go if he wanted to hide?" he asked. "Well, I know he likes Italy best. He also likes Greece, and all of Spain is a possibility, I suppose." "I see," McCarran said, suddenly looking tired. "Well, thank you, Mr. Ripley. I have your address and phone number if I need to speak to you again." Chapter 15. The Will. Mr. Greenleaf, Mick McCarran, and Marge all left for Rome together. Tom spent the afternoon at home expecting a telephone call from the detectives, but none came. There was only a call from Countess Titi inviting him to a cocktail party that evening. The following day McCarran called, but he only wanted to know all the names of Dickie's friends in Montebello and Naples. Tom went through them with all their difficult address, all except Signor Pucci, who had sold the house and boat for him. "You have never met this painter, De Massimo?" McCarran asked. "No, I saw him once, but I never met him," Tom said. "Well, what did he look like?" "Well, it was just a street corner. I left Dickie as he was going to meet him, so I wasn't very close to him. He looked about 5'9", about 50, gray-black hair. He wore a light gray suit." Okay," McCarran said slowly, as if he were writing all that down. "Well, that's about everything. Thanks very much, Mr. Ripley." "You're welcome. Good luck." The weeks went past and there were no more calls. Tom went to more parties and spent time with his wealthy friend. Peter Smith Kingsley had a couple of English newspapers that his friends had sent him. There were pictures in them of Tom in the streets of Venice and one of his house. "I'm so tired of it," Tom said. "I'm only staying here to try to help if I can, but there are journalists everywhere." "I understand," Peter said. "I'm going home at the end of May, you know. If you'd like to come along and stay at my place in Ireland, you'd be welcome. It's very quiet there." Tom stared at him. Peter had told him about his old Irish castle and had showed him some pictures of it. Then Tom had a sudden memory of his relationship with Dickie, like a pale ghost. The same thing could happen with Peter, he realized. Peter, who was kind and not at all suspicious, except that he, Tom, did not look enough like Peter. But one night he had spoken in an English-sounding voice and acted like Peter, and Peter had thought it was really funny. It now made Tom feel terribly ashamed. "Thanks," he said, and suddenly he was nearly crying. "But I'd better stay by myself for a little longer. I miss my friend Dickie, you know. I missed him terribly." "Don't worry," replied Peter softly, touching him on the shoulder. "Of course you do. I'd really think something was wrong with you if you didn't feel like this." Venice, June 3rd. Dear Mr. Greenleaf, while I was packing today, I found an envelope that Richard gave me in Rome, and that I'd completely forgotten about it. On the envelope was written, "Not to be opened until June," and of course, now it is June. Inside it, I found a will written by Richard that leaves everything to me. I'm very shocked by this, as I'm sure you are too. I'm so sorry that I did not remember having the envelope, because it would have shown much earlier that Richard planned to take his own life. I put it in a suitcase pocket and then forgot about it. I'm sending you a copy of the will so that you may see it for yourself. This is the first will I have ever seen in my life, and I don't know what to do next. Please say hello to Mrs. Greenleaf for me, and tell her how sorry I am I had to write this letter. It would be good to hear from you as soon as possible. My address will be American Express, Athens, Greece. Yours, Tom Ripley. I was asking for trouble, but he only had 2,000 left in his bank, and he knew he must not take any more money from Dickie's account. So why not try all of his money? He had bought his ticket for the voyage to Greece in the middle of May, and the days had grown warmer. He was so bored after the gray, quiet weeks in Venice. He guessed that he was safe. He had not heard from Overeeny, and even the newspapers had stopped writing about Dickie and Freddie Miles. 2 days after Tom sailed, he went to tea at the house of Countess Titi. The maid showed him into the living room, and Titi entered soon after. "Ah, Tommaso," she cried, her eyes wide with excitement. "Have you seen the newspaper? They have found Dickie's suitcase, right here in the American Express in Venice." "What?" Tom had not seen the papers. "Read it here. They were sent from Naples. Perhaps he is here in Venice." Tom read the story carefully. The paper around Dickie's paintings had come undone, and someone had noticed Dickie's signature on them. The police were now looking at everything for fingerprints. "Perhaps he is alive," shouted Titi. "I don't think this means he's alive," said Tom. "It says here that the suitcases and paintings were sent under the name Robert Fanshawe. Dickie could have been murdered or killed himself after he sent the suitcases. His passports were even there. He packed his passport." "Perhaps he's hiding himself under the name of Robert Fanshawe. Oh, sit down, Tom. You need some tea." "No, but it says here that he packed all his bathroom stuff and his shoes and coat. Everything. He couldn't be alive and leave all of that. The murderer must have taken his clothes and put everything in the American Express. It was probably the easiest way to get rid of it." He was not leaving until the day after tomorrow, Tom thought. There were lots of time for Overeeny to get his, Tom's, fingerprints and compare them to the stuff in the suitcases, and then to Dickie's. Wouldn't Mr. Greenleaf have sent Dickie's fingerprints from America immediately? He tried to turn his thoughts to Greece. To him, Greece was a place covered in gold. He imagined stone statues with strong, calm faces. He did not want to go to Greece with questions about fingerprints and the police hanging over his head. It would make him feel so ashamed as low as it was possible to feel. Tom dropped his face in his hands and began to cry. Titi put her fat arm around him. "Tommaso, why are you crying? Wait until you have a reason to be unhappy." "I can't see why you don't see this is a bad sign," Tom said sadly. "I really don't." By the time he got on the ship to Athens, Tom was like a walking ghost. He had heard nothing from Overeeny, and that was a bad sign, as his messages before had always been so friendly. He stayed in his cabin most of the time and had not been able to sleep or eat for days. He knew that Mr. Greenleaf had received the letter about the will now. If the police discovered his fingerprints on Dickie's things, and then the signature on the will was also forged, it might put Tom in the electric chair. He spent that evening walking up and down the ship and talking to no one. He just wanted to be alone. What if the captain was now receiving a message to arrest Tom Ripley? He, Tom, would stand up bravely, or he might throw himself into the sea. Well, what if he did? He was not afraid. If they got him on the fingerprints and on the will, had it not been worth the months for November until now? Of course it had. He had wished that he had seen more of the world. That was all. He wanted to see Australia and India. He wanted to see Japan. Since knowing Dickie, he had become interested in paintings. He did not want to be a painter, but if he had the money, he wanted to collect them. The following morning, the boat approached Greece. Tom stood at the front and saw 4 policemen standing in a line with folded arms, staring up at the ship. Tom collected his suitcases and walked down on the harbor, then turned towards the policemen. "I'll just tell them who I am," he thought. "I won't shoot or run." The policemen stared back at him. He smiled at them a little. Then one of them touched his hat, and they all stood to one side. He walked between them toward a newspaper shop, and they did not look at him at all. Chapter 16. In Greece. Tom stared at the different newspapers in front of him, feeling strange and lightheaded. He pulled out one French and one Italian newspaper and paid for them with Lyre. The policemen were still not looking for him. He read the papers while he was waiting for a bus to Athens. "No one named Robert Fanshawe found," said one of the second page. Only the 5th paragraph of the article interested Tom. The police decided a few days ago that fingerprints on the suitcases and paintings are the same as the fingerprints found in Mr. Greenleaf's apartments in Rome. They have decided that they are definitely Mr. Greenleaf's fingerprints. And on the other page of the paper, the police have decided that Signor Greenleaf sent the suitcases to Venice himself and then killed himself. Or he may be still living under the name of Fanshawe. The police believe it is time to give up searching for Richard Greenleaf, as he is not traveling under his Richard Greenleaf passport. Tom got on the bus for Athens. There would be a letter about the will waiting for him at the American Express in Athens, Tom was sure. Perhaps the letter would be a polite no from Mr. Greenleaf's lawyer, followed by a letter from the police saying that he wanted for forgery. The will could undo it all. Maybe the Greek police would be waiting for him at the American Express. The bus stopped in the city. Tom got out and found a taxi. "Would you take me to the American Express, please?" he said in Italian, but thankfully the man seemed to understand him. When they arrived, he sat up straight and looked around the building for policemen. Perhaps they were inside. He asked the driver to wait, and he seemed to understand that too. Everything felt very easy and calm. He walked up to the desk. "Have you got any letters for Thomas Ripley?" he asked, quietly in English. The young woman turned and searched, then smiled. "2 letters," she said. One was from Titi in Greece. The other was from Mr. Greenleaf. June 9th. Dear Tom, I received your letter of June 3rd yesterday. The will was not as much of a surprise to me and my wife. We both knew that Richard cared a lot about you, even if he didn't say that in his letters. As you say, this does seem to suggest that Richard took his own life. It's also possible that Richard has taken another name and decided to turn his back on his family. My wife agrees with me that we should do what Richard wanted, so I have given the copy of the will to my lawyers, who will take things forward from here. Thank you again for your help when I was in Italy. Please write to us. With best wishes, Herbert Greenleaf. Was it a joke? But of course, Mr. Greenleaf would not joke about this. Tom walked out to the waiting taxi. It was no joke. It was his. Tiki's money and his life, his wonderful free life. He could have a house in Europe and a house in America too if he was close. After Athens, he was going to go to Crete. He imagined the tall mountains, the young men waiting for his cases, and the money he would give them for carrying them. He would have plenty of it to give them. Then, his body suddenly went cold as he imagined the line of Cretan policemen waiting for him on the harbor wall. Would he imagine policemen waiting for him at every harbor that he sailed to? In Alexandria, Istanbul, Bombay, Rio? But it was stupid to think about that. He pulled his shoulders back. "To a hotel, please," Tom said to the taxi driver. "The best one. The best."